Welcome to the Taking a Breath podcast with Parker Mays.
Alrighty, welcome back everybody to this week's episode of the Taking a Breath podcast. Thank you so much for joining. I'm excited because as we're coming out of this series that we've been doing with kind of content creators and entrepreneurs, we're kind of bridging this gap smoothly because I've kind of brought someone who's right in the middle. We've been doing a lot of coaches. We've been doing a lot of content, brand awareness and platforms. And it's funny because Anna, my guest today, is kind of in between this, right? She's not coaching on content as much, but she's in the content space and has an incredible story to share with you all today. So not only is she local to the North Carolina area where I am, which is always incredible to meet people from the area, but also she is a cancer survivor and advocate, and specifically shares her story on her blog, My Cancer Chic. And so this has been somewhere where she not only puts out written content, but where she's been putting her story out on social media to inspire other women, and then also just individuals who may need that hope from her message, right? And so for us as students today, I think there's going to be a ton of value that we're going to get from hearing her story. And even from just meeting her for the last 15 minutes, I already can see so much love and joy and energy from her. So Anna Crollman, thank you so much for being here today. Would love for you to just share a brief introduction with us and how you got to where you are with your blog.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, Parker. I really appreciate it. I'm so excited about your mission and inspiring students and youth and young adults. And so my story is a little twisty-turny with some big barriers in the way, including the giant big C word, cancer, as well as some big shifts in reinventing my life and figuring out kind of who I wanted to be and what that mission was after a big life-changing event like that. So my blog really came out of my own struggles and trying to process my grief and shifting my thinking and my change physically and mentally, and then really finding ways to give back to the community and use that story to inspire other people.
I love that. And one of the things that you mentioned there, right off the bat is this idea of being able to, when something happens, when life throws something huge like that at you, being able to roll with it, being able to still see, positives or move from it. And so for you, as you started this journey with, diagnosed with cancer and what was coming next, uncertainty of what was coming next, what was that initial reaction like for you? And what was your mindset going into it initially?
So I think initially it was shock and grief and how am I going to survive this, especially as a young adult. I was thinking, okay, I'm going to go bankrupt. How are we going to pay for this? I can't have
Right.
my family that I wanted, all of these kind of like, oh no, I can't do X. And so it was definitely a shift of, okay, this is what I thought my path was going to look like right now.
Right.
That may not be my path right now, but maybe it will be later. And so shifting that mindset to say, okay, this is temporary. This is what I'm going through for this section of time,
Right.
and trying to think of and imagine that life beyond. And I think that level of hope and positivity that I tried to bring to the situation and try to find ways to take control of the situation.
Yeah.
My blog and my writing was one way to do that. It helped me kind of shift the narrative and say, this is the story that I am choosing to tell about my cancer diagnosis instead of this is something that's happening to me.
Yeah. And in those moments, did you find it hard to be in the moment and focus on, hey, this is like one day at a time? Do when you're in that moment versus now, what's the perspective change look like from having this to now being able to share your story with other people?
That's a really great question. And I think in the moment, it was definitely a lot harder. There were many moments of fear and being overwhelmed. For example, after chemo, sometimes I would get very sick
Mm,
and it laying in bed, kind of crying and feeling really down and feeling like this is never going to end. Like I'm going to feel
mm,
sick and horrible forever.
yeah.
And so my husband and I kind of we would call them pity parties, and I'd text him and I'd say, hey, I need you to come home so we can have a pity party. And we would just cry and be sad for like an hour, and we'd set a timer. And then, like, when that time was up, we were like, okay, I feel better. Like, okay, this is just today. And remember that, like, next week, you're
Mm,
probably going to feel better. I think now it's hard to remember what that felt like. It's much
Wow.
easier for me to talk about it in an abstract sense, which makes me even more grateful that I wrote about it then in the moment.
Yeah.
Because I think as we look back on our lives, we forget how difficult those moments were. We're able to talk to them from a different perspective and kind of context of our lives. And so I always kind of share that with people as I'm talking to them when they're going through it, like, hey, go back and read this of like what I said when I was there because I
Yeah.
can relate to that. I remember what it felt like.
What kept you going in those moments, right? And especially I didn't know that story about, sitting there and just letting the emotions flow. But in those
Mhm.
moments, what kept you moving forward? What kept you pushing through it?
I think for me, one of my big motivations was to have a family. That was kind of one of my biggest
Hmm.
like life goals at the time. And so being told like I had cancer and I couldn't have kids at that time, there was still this hope in the back of my mind that like my time would come to be a mother and to have those options. And even just to celebrate with my friends or to, travel. We loved traveling. I loved like my job at the time, being able to advance in my career. I think there were so many things that I was like, I'm too young. I'm still ready to do all these things. And that kept me kind of motivated to say, okay, this is temporary. I'm going to get through this cancer thing. And then I still get to have a life after.
Yeah. And how long was that from start to end, right? From diagnosis to when, you finally are moving past it?
That's a good question. So, I mean, a lot of people think you just kind of go through treatment and then when it's
Right.
over, you're done. And so, one of the biggest things I try to advocate and educate on is that the survivorship piece of when you're actually done with what's called active treatment is actually somewhat of the harder point because your
Hmm.
support falls away. You're not going to doctor's appointments all the time. And for me, I was also on a long-term medication that impacts your quality of life. And
Hmm.
so for me, I'm still on that to this day. I would say like my big active treatment chunk was a year. And so after that year, I would say things started to shift a little bit of me being able to put other things more as a priority instead of my treatment. But it
Hmm.
is still kind of that constant adjustment to life after.
Wow. And that's so interesting because I've had a family member who has gone through that process and still has the medication, but it's definitely like that different frame of mind. And you mentioned it specifically, like not going to the doctor's appointments all the time and it not being as front of mind. How can we as just individuals and especially as students, right? Because a lot of us are young and you were younger when this happened, right? And
Mhm.
younger,
Yeah.
not necessarily 18, 22, but in your 20s. How can those of us who are younger and maybe have family members or parents or grandparents that are struggling with, how can we be that support structure? I mean, when you talk to families, how can we be there for individuals going through something like this?
That's such a great question. And one I get asked a lot because I think now having been on the other side, I do feel like I can share. And I think one of the biggest things is checking on people, just like their
Mm,
emotional state and, saying like quick texts, hey, I'm thinking about you today. How are you doing? Because
yeah.
one of the other aspects of going through cancer, especially at a young age in your 20s, is that it can be very isolating because the rest
Mhm.
of the people around you are either like working, traveling, having fun, living their
Right.
best lives and you're kind of stuck in this alternate reality. And so hearing from people, having them
Mm,
check in, say just like, hey, how are you doing today? Like, I'm thinking about you. Or I like getting snail mail, like someone sending me a card or like a
yeah.
funny playlist, or I would have a friend that would send me different memes each day, like that
I
I
love
knew I was
that.
going to chemo, like just little things. I think a lot of times we get worried about saying the right thing, but it's
Mm,
actually like not saying anything that is the hardest. And
wow.
so having people just show up in those small ways, I think can really be helpful.
Oh, that's super cool and very actionable for anyone who's listening who may not have thought of that or may not be that invested. I know for me, it's like if I'm not there, like in the hospital, right, I'm like feel disconnected from it, but it's very real, very tangible that it can make a difference for someone even from afar. One of the things that I was thinking about is for someone who is more distant from situations like this, especially those of us who are younger, right, may not have encountered as much of that in our lives yet. And I'm curious about, hey, I haven't gone through this with someone who's close to me, but it's something that could happen, right? When you first hear about that, I'm curious about how I can react or support in a way that is not, I don't want to say like offensive, but just I'm thinking about how can I approach that type of situation and conversation where someone shares that information and that weight with me in a way that is appropriate.
That is such a great question. I was actually thinking about doing like a TikTok or a reel about this because there's so many things that people say that are like not great.
Yes.
And I don't think it ever comes from a malicious standpoint. People aren't saying something because they mean to hurt you. But the way our culture is, when something is new to us, I mean, this is just the world, we're usually very questioning of it and we don't understand it. And so we speak from a point of, trying to understand. And sometimes those words don't come out right. And while I hate to I don't want to contradict what I previously said about being supportive of just being there, I think there are a couple of things to think about when you are getting news of cancer from someone. And one is, try not to connect it to negative situations that have happened to you. A lot of times for many of us, the first time we hear that someone has cancer in our lives, we connect it to the only other cancer scenario that we've had in our time, especially when we're young. Those are usually an older person,
Right.
maybe an aunt or an uncle or a grandparent that has died. And especially for a young person being diagnosed with cancer, for their first words to be, "Oh wow, I had an aunt that died of cancer," is extremely traumatic, because
Wow.
then you're already spiraling thinking about your own mortality. So instead, saying things like, "I can't imagine what that's like going through this," or, "Wow, this really sucks and I'm here for you," or, "We'll get through this together. I don't know what it's going to look like, but I just want you to know that I'm here as your friend." Very kind of more supportive versus kind of trying to make those connections. Another thing that's really common that can be really hurtful is that when people hear about cancer, they start thinking about what in their lives they can change to be healthier and to be more proactive, which is completely normal. But sometimes that question, when they're talking to people that have cancer, can come out in a way that blames the cancer patient. And so, for example, I'll let you know, a lot of times people ask me, "What did you do to get cancer?" Instead of, "Are there things that you've changed in your life since having a cancer diagnosis?" So it's a very different emotion connected to each of those,
Right.
and something that people may not see or be mindful of. But so that's why I always try to educate, like, "Hey,
Wow.
here's a way you could ask about cancer without it feeling hurtful." So I hope those were a couple kind of concrete examples.
100%. And of course, you answered that wonderfully. And the question, I wasn't even sure how to ask that question, right? As you could tell. And so, because I'm like tiptoeing around, like, oh, I don't want to say something wrong, right? But the whole
Yeah.
subject, right? In my experience, because I haven't had that much experience with it, is something that I'm always feeling like I'm tiptoeing around. So even in this interview, being transparent, as I'm thinking through what questions do I want to ask, I'm like, is this going to offend? Is this something that's appropriate to ask? And so I do
Yeah.
appreciate just your transparency and just being willing to open and share, because yeah, both of those things, connecting it back to a situation that's happened in the past to me, or connecting it to, oh, well, what did you do? And the specifically the nuances in how you asked one versus the other, one being much more confrontational or faulting the person versus one being more, hey, like positive forward motion, right? Both of the changes being, hey, we're excited, we're going to get through this together. It's supportive, it's moving forward. So I completely see that, and really valuable, really specific tips for people. Is there anything that you found as you've started? And I'm assuming that because of all the work that you do with content now, people reach out more than maybe they had before you went through something like this, or before you started sharing your story. Are there things that you find that people are looking for in the support, or when they're sharing their story with you? I mean, you as someone that's in the space, is it something that they're looking at you for like the perspective of, oh, you're on the other side of this, what can I expect? Or what do you find people reaching out to you for?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think the number one thing that I have people reaching out for is exactly what you just said,
Mm,
the hope and the realization of a life after. Because when you're in it, even though you'd asked me before, how did you get through? What was your hope? Yes, I did have hope, but I didn't have a concrete image of what that looked like. I was
right.
kind of like wishing on a star, like, yes, I hope that there is a life after for me. And so that's why I really do try to share kind of all aspects of my life on social media, things that don't relate to cancer at all, so that people can see, yes, this girl went through this in her 20s, and now here she is 6 years later. She has a son. She goes out to events. She's like eating, she's having fun, like she's traveling just to see the normal aspects of life that sometimes it's really hard to imagine
Mm,
when you're in that moment. So I think a lot of that. And then also, you touched on something when you were saying, hey, I don't even know how to ask things.
yeah.
One thing that I get a lot is, other people with cancer will reach out, and it can be really helpful to talk to someone that does get it. Like the support of our communities and our family and our friends that aren't going through it is amazing and needed. But it also, there's nothing like being able to talk to someone who is in it. And I think that applies to all areas of life. If you're a young athlete, being able to talk to another athlete, right? Or if you're in a certain career, being able to talk to someone. So I try to make a lot of connections for people too, of, oh, here's somebody you can talk to, or you're going through this. Well, did you know so and so is too? Why don't I like put you guys together? Almost like
Hmm.
a matching kind of
I
thing.
love that. I love that. And especially having the platform that you have now that you started to build out. And when it starts to scale, I just love to see the impact of people where they're commenting saying, wow, this really encouraged me today. Or the people that are, I'm sure, in your DMs or in your email inbox and all of these things, just saying, I read this story, I read this piece. I'm curious, at what point did it shift from, okay, this is something that happened to, okay, this is something that I want to share with other people? When did that shift happen for you?
So for me, it actually happened really early. This all happened in 2015. And at the time, blogs and Pinterest were pretty big.
Yep.
Instagram stories hadn't started yet. TikTok wasn't really around. So I was going to blogs for just like normal lifestyle content. I was
Okay.
very into fashion and beauty and just like career advice. And so immediately when I was diagnosed, that was where I went to look for content for
Oh, wow.
myself. And I was like, Googling, okay, young woman with cancer, wigs, young women, all these phrases, trying to figure out, okay, how do I find what I'm looking for?
Wow.
And I couldn't find it. And so probably within 30 days, I was like, okay, I'm starting a blog. Like
Mm,
it was like right after my first surgery, just because I felt like it was a gap. And I said, if I am going through this searching for the resources, there has to be at least one other person out there searching for the same
right.
resources.
Yeah.
So why not create it? And that's kind of where it began. Yeah, August 2015.
I love that. And to see the longevity over time, right? People think in short terms now, right? They think, oh, I'm going to start this page in 6 months. It's going to be massive. If it's not, it's terrible, right? Well, you've been doing
Yeah,
this for 6 years now, probably 6 years, what, this week or something like that? You said August 15th,
yeah, you're right.
six
Yeah.
years this week?
Actually, August 17th. I said 15th, but it's the 17th. So yeah, 6-year anniversary of my blog. I think
Literally this
early
week.
next week.
Oh
Yeah.
my gosh, that's incredible. So, well,
Yeah.
congratulations to that. First of all, because
Thank
we're just having
you.
that realization right here in the moment. But no, it takes time to build a platform. It takes time to build content out, and people are thinking in such short terms. Whereas you can look back the last 6 years at all the content, the audience, and all of this, and see, wow, like a long-term investment, but so much reward from the people that are now able to check out the content at scale. For you, when you first started it, who was that one person that you wanted to reach, right? We talk about creating audiences, and you know this, but like when you thought of that target audience of one, what was that person going through at the time they found they found your content?
Absolutely. I love that you touch on that because I talk about that a lot. When people want to start a blog or they come to me and they say, hey, I want to do something similar. I'm like, okay, well, what is your thing?
Yes.
What's your niche? what's unique about you, and then everyone has a voice that's valuable to share, but what is
Mm,
your audience? And like you said, get very clear. For me, the audience was a 20 to 35-year-old young woman facing a breast cancer diagnosis with no
mm,
kids.
wow.
Because to me, that was a huge aspect of my journey, was not having children yet and wanting to. And so at the time when I started, that was my like very clear niche and
Right.
audience. Over time, my audience has changed,
Right.
and I then adapt and pivot based on who my audience is to better serve them and stay true to my story. But at that time, I was very specific with who my audience was. And so all of my content and my experiences were very much written in that vein, which
Mm.
ended up, I think, leading to the long-term success and the ability for me to be a little bit more flexible in my audience later on.
Yeah. And getting specific there helps to find the right people, which then expands over time. And for 6 years, of course, like this audience has expanded. It's not all 20 to 35-year-old women facing a diagnosis. It's even
Exactly.
people like me who stumble across your content and are inspired by your story, right? And I don't fit any of that demographic, right? But
Exactly.
how now do you see your audience, right? So now is your audience just basically anyone who is looking? Are you still putting out content for that one person and just other people are seeing it? What's your kind of strategy? This is me as kind of content creator, just trying to get in your mind a little bit there.
Yeah. So I think it has constantly been a challenge, to be completely transparent, of
Okay.
figuring out where I want to take my brand. Because
Mm,
initially, when it started, it was very much a blog and a very focused niche and audience. And
right.
obviously, since it has been such a personal story for me, there has been this element of, well, how will the brand evolve with me? And
Right.
what do I want the brand to represent? And when you're sharing your life, you do have to kind of set those boundaries and determine, like, what do I want to share and what's my focus? And
Right.
so with time, that audience of young breast cancer survivor between these ages grew first to, okay, not just young breast cancer survivor, because I started finding it was all kinds of cancer survivors. And
Right.
then it grew from not just breast cancer to all cancers. And then from there, it grew from all cancers to people facing adversity. And so that's
Mm,
kind of where I am right now, is that people facing adversity in any form of their life, whether that is a divorce, a loss of a job, a loss of a parent, a shift in career. I mean, everybody's version of adversity is different.
right.
But I have found that my story can be inspirational and powerful to people of any kind of life experience that they're going through that, and that many
Mm,
of the themes that I speak about from my cancer experience can address those. And so while my content is very much still fashion, beauty, wellness, and my lifestyle with my son,
right.
that the story of me can apply to many people, and the messaging and the concepts that I talk about can apply. So I
Mm.
hope that answers your question of kind of the broader audience.
100% does. And last thing that I want to get into, and I know you gave me permission to ask about it beforehand, is your son and just kind of your family dynamic and why for you, because as you're going through all this stuff, I know the like long-term thing. Why is he this thing that has just become, I mean, and I see him in your content, all of this stuff, and just so much like joy and love, like, so for
Yeah.
you, I mean, why is that story of just him being in your life so incredibly impactful for you?
So I think, it's a couple of things. I mean, one, I mentioned at the very beginning, being diagnosed with cancer at a very young age. There is an aspect of your chemotherapy that can impact fertility for men and women at young ages. And so there's always this unknown of, am I going to be able to have children naturally after cancer? And for me, it was a very long road to that point, filled with pregnancy losses and some infertility, and then finally being able to have my son naturally, which
Wow.
I was open to parenthood by any means at that point. But
Sure.
I think for my audience, being able to be with me through all of those stages of
Mm,
my life and evolution, and then see me get to this point, there is so much investment in my son's life that when he was born, I felt like he was like this idol to people, like this literal like human being representation of hope, which like
Yeah.
sounds kind of crazy, but for people that like have been with me for 6 years and have seen that,
Right.
I mean, even for me, sometimes I forget the magnitude of everything I've been through. And so I think for my audience to be able to share that with me and see like this roller coaster of life throwing curveballs, and then being
Mm,
able to say, hey, here now is this life after cancer and this like brand new human being that is just beautiful and wonderful to the world. And not to say that like life doesn't still have its own levels of adversity and struggle, but to be able to see like that, I think is just impactful to anyone, no matter what your like background or knowledge of cancer is.
love it. I love it. And it's cool that you've been able to share so many pieces of your journey with your audience, right? Because over
Mhm.
years and years, you're going to change, your story's going to evolve, new things are going to happen, and new milestones are going to happen. And so being able to evolve with it and share your story with it is just so cool. And I'm hoping for myself, right? Like I'm thinking future, right?
Yeah.
I've been doing this for a year, I've done 70 episodes and all of this, but in 5 years, where has it taken me, right? And how many people have I connected with and shared their stories and all of this stuff? So, from your side of things, I'm just seeing, oh, wow, like there is so much potential for where in 5 years, I can be, any of the listeners can be, right? That's in that age range and just at any age range. So your story is
I
just
love
so
that.
incredible. And Anna, if people want to connect more with you, more with your content, what's the best place for them to go?
Place for me is Instagram. I'm super active on Instagram stories and always try to make a point to reply to all DMs. So show me some patience if you message me and it's been a couple days, but I promise I make it through all those messages. So I am super excited to connect with some of your audience. And
Love
I
it.
think, I'm just so passionate about you reaching a younger demographic too, because I
Thank you.
think empowering that age group and being able to like plant this seed of hope and passion for the future is just so wonderful. So thank you for all that you
Thank
do
you.
and for having me on.
Thanks so much, Anna. Hey, and just for everybody that has made it to the end here, so Anna's Instagram is at My Cancer Chic, but it'll also be linked in the description. So just make sure to click there, go give her a follow, check out some of her content. But then also, I've got an event coming up. It's a virtual event. It's going to be on September 4th from 10 a.m. to 11:30 a.m. Eastern. I've lined up some guests for us. We got some partners from around the U.S. And so if you are in the 18 to 22-year-old age range, come check us out there. I'm going to be hosting, but like I said, we're going to have a lineup of TEDx style speakers, and that will be all under the umbrella of building unshakable confidence. So if that's something you're looking to do, come check us out there. That again is September 4th from 10 a.m. to 11:30 a.m. Eastern. Thanks so much for listening, and I appreciate you all. We will see you again next week for another episode.
Thanks for listening to the Taking a Breath podcast with Parker Mays.